It is a pleasure to introduce Dr. James Miskell and his online video webinar, which is entitled Community Awareness and Emergency Preparedness, Crucial Parts of Homeland Security. Dr. Jim Miskell, who's been a member of the Homeland Security Management Institute's renowned faculty of senior fellows since 2006, has an exceptional background as a scholar as well as a practitioner in the Homeland Security and Homeland Defense fields. Over the course of his career, Dr. Miskell has held a variety of academic, government, and private sector positions focusing on national security and emergency management issues. Jim Miskell served for 12 years as professor and associate dean at the Naval War College. He served as deputy assistant associate director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and he worked in the White House as director of defense policy and arms control with the National Security Council. In addition to his teaching responsibilities with Homeland Security Management Institute, Dr. Miskell is a consultant on emergency management and emergency preparedness issues to government and private sector entities that include the Rhode Island Economic Development Council. He is widely published in the field, having authored 4 books and numerous peer-reviewed articles dealing with contemporary homeland security, national security, and emergency management issues. He is co-principal investigator on the Homeland Security Management Institute's Community Awareness, Community Preparedness Training Project, which is funded through a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as one of the Institute's DHS Center of Excellence projects. This is the background and expertise Dr. Jim Miskell, a nationally recognized expert and a true practitioner scholar, brings to this online video webinar. Few, if any, scholars bring this broad range of professional experience and practical expertise to their teaching and their research. Issues of community awareness and community preparedness are central to the Homeland Security enterprise, to developing a national culture of preparedness, to public safety and security, and to building resilient and adaptive communities across the nation. Prepared individuals and prepared communities are better equipped to withstand acts of terrorism, natural and human-made disasters, and other threats and hazards we face, and to mitigate, respond to, and recover from their effects. As an expert in this field, Dr. Jim Miskell is exceptionally well qualified to offer this presentation on contemporary community awareness and emergency preparedness issues. Jim?
Welcome to this webinar on emergency preparedness and community awareness. It is offered to you by the Homeland Security Management Institute, which is part of Long Island University. HSMI is one of the Department of Homeland Security's Centers of Excellence. We hope you find the webinar interesting and informative. We should start by explaining what 2 important terms mean: emergency preparedness and community awareness. Community awareness refers to the level of vigilance and alertness in a community regarding potentially dangerous situations or suspicious activity, for example, an unattended bag at an airport. Emergency preparedness refers to 2 things: the steps that a family, business, and community can take to reduce the effects of a potential disaster, and steps that get families, businesses, and communities ready to deal with actual emergencies or disasters. Let's discuss terrorism and community awareness first. It is important to note that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has a lead responsibility for preventing terrorism in the United States and for apprehending alleged terrorists. Even so, state and local police forces have major roles. Each state has a joint terrorism task force and fusion center to help coordinate law enforcement's response to warnings about terror plots. One of the most important sources of these warnings is from the public, from communities that are alert. In fact, local and state police forces are often the first to identify people planning terror attacks. Police rely upon community awareness to alert them about suspicious behavior or to notify them about potentially dangerous materials left in public places. Studies of terror attacks here and abroad indicate that terrorists often engage in some of the following activities while they are planning for an attack. Citizens who notify police when they know of someone doing these things might very well help prevent a terror attack. Here are some examples of incidents in which alert citizens saw something suspicious and reported it to local police. In all but one of these cases, the FBI and police were able to catch the plotters before their plots went very far. The exception is the so-called Times Square bombing. In this case, the plot reached fruition, but alert citizens noted smoke from a parked car, and the police sealed off the area before any damage could be done. In the past few years, there have been some instances of American citizens participating in terror operations overseas. This clearly indicates that some American citizens are being radicalized and becoming more involved with international terror organizations. This could mean more attacks on the U.S. in the future. American citizens committing terror acts overseas is one form of international terrorism, thankfully a rare form. There are also two other types of international terrorism. One involves acts like 9/11 attacks that were planned and executed by terrorists based in other countries. The other is attacks on Americans in overseas locations, for example, tourists, businessmen, government officials, and military personnel stationed in another country. And, of course, attacks on American facilities in other countries. Another disturbing trend is the number of terror attacks by individuals or very small groups of conspirators unaffiliated with established terror organizations. This may make them more difficult to catch without help from the public because these lone wolves might not be on the radar screens of law enforcement. In addition to lone wolf terrorists, there are some terror organizations based in the United States that are capable of carrying out dangerous attacks. Several are listed in this slide. Various elements of the transportation sector in the United States and in other countries as well have been frequent targets of terrorists. Here are three examples of airliners being targeted. Fortunately, in two of these incidents, the alert passengers subdued the terrorists and prevented any damage from occurring. As you can see from this slide, airports, both here and abroad, have also been targeted by terrorists. That is one reason why the Transportation Security Administration and airport authorities frequently remind travelers to be alert to unattended baggage and packages. Subways, trains, and train stations in cities like New York, London, and Madrid have been targeted by terrorists. As this chart indicates, these attacks have caused extensive numbers of casualties. Other targets of terrorists have included government and private sector office buildings, abortion clinics, and even universities. In other words, terrorists have attacked a wide variety of targets. For this reason, people everywhere should be alert to suspicious behavior. If you see something suspicious, say something. Say it to the police, to security personnel in your office building or on your campus, or to the crews of a plane, train, or ship that you're traveling on. If you say something, you might help prevent an attack and help the authorities catch terrorist plotters. We are now going to talk about emergency preparedness, being ready to deal with emergencies like disasters. In a sense, community awareness is part of emergency preparedness. An aware community knows when to start getting serious about getting ready. There are a few general things that everyone should know about the emergency response system in the United States. First, the system is based upon the traditional federal-state structure established by the Constitution. This means that the states and local governments have the primary governmental responsibility for responding to emergencies. Every year there are hundreds, if not thousands, of emergencies, and most are handled well by local and state agencies. Except in cases of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, the federal government's role is to supplement the work of the states. In the previous slide, we emphasized that states and local governments have the primary governmental responsibility. There is a more basic responsibility, that of the families and businesses that are affected by an emergency. That is why we should think of them as the real first responders. They are on scene first, and the steps that they take to care for themselves and their neighbors are crucial. The better prepared families and business people are, when an emergency occurs, the lesser the damage and the quicker the community can recover. There are many useful online resources for people to use to find out more about what they should do to get prepared. The first two on this slide are government sites. Both are run by FEMA. The third is the Red Cross website, which, like the FEMA sites, has a large amount of information about preparedness. Then, too, each state has an emergency management agency, and the websites of these agencies are also excellent sources of practical information. The initial steps that government takes in an emergency are taken by the local authorities, specifically the fire and police departments. Under the incident management system, the first fire or police officer on scene is the incident commander. That person stays in charge until he or she is relieved by a more senior officer. The incident commander decides what resources should be brought to bear. This may include requesting help from neighboring communities or from the state. A typical example would be to request additional firefighting personnel and equipment from the next town. In severe emergencies, help from the federal government may also be requested. Local governments often do need help from their neighbors during an emergency, so most municipalities have negotiated mutual aid agreements with their neighbors. The agreements institutionalize the process and let the participants know exactly what additional resources might actually be available during an emergency. When resources from nearby communities are not sufficient, help may be requested from the state and federal governments. If resources are requested from the state, the governor decides what resources can be made available from state agencies, like the ones listed on this chart. The National Guard is usually a prime contributor to disaster recovery. Guardsmen do everything from filling sandbags when flood waters are expected to transporting disaster victims to hospital. Then there is the private sector. Non-profit organizations like the Red Cross help disaster victims out with food and shelter, and the help that these organizations provide cannot be overestimated. For-profit corporations also make major contributions. Utility companies restore power to affected homes and businesses, and without power, recovery is impossible. Insurance companies pay claims for policyholders. That enables them to start rebuilding. It should be noted that corporations and nonprofit organizations do have plans to send additional personnel to disaster zones to accelerate recovery. For example, after a hurricane, utility companies in unaffected parts of the state or in other states will send repair crews to help the local utility company repair transmission lines and restore service. If an emergency is severe enough, the federal government may be asked to help out by the governor of the affected state. If the governor's request is approved by the president, federal resources will be made available. Ordinarily, the federal assistance consists of writing checks, reimbursing the state for some of its disaster-related expenses, and providing grants of money to families affected by the disaster. In some cases, though, federal agencies will do things like help clear roads, conduct search and rescue operations, and build tent cities. Since it can take time for government agencies, the Red Cross, and utility companies to fully respond, it makes sense for families to prepare for situations in which, 1, they may be stranded in their homes without electricity for days, or 2, they may have to evacuate on short notice to a safer location. That is why experts recommend that families maintain 3 days' worth of emergency supplies, create a portable go bag or go kit, and develop a brief emergency plan. This slide depicts the kinds of supplies families ought to keep on hand, especially when a storm is predicted. Since pharmacies may be closed as a result of the storm, it makes sense to be sure ahead of time that there are enough essential medications for the family and for family pets. Water is probably the single most important thing in an emergency. Each family should have 3 gallons per person on hand, in case there is no municipal water or electricity for several days. If a family has to evacuate on short notice, it's possible that important things might be left behind. That's why experts recommend that families build a go bag of important documents and supplies that will be ready to take if an evacuation is ordered. An emergency plan should also be developed. This is a brief document that contains important contact information and explains where families plan to go in an evacuation. Such a plan can be particularly important if family members get separated. That way, everyone will know who to call and where to meet. Emergency preparedness and community awareness are 2 sides of the same coin. An aware community can avoid some emergencies and will be more attuned to the need for preparedness. A prepared community will experience less damage in emergencies and will recover more quickly. Please do take a few minutes to tell us what you think of this webinar. Please complete our brief survey at the following address.